Welcome to CHGO Red Stars podcast presented by DraftKings. If you're the betting kind, you got to make sure to use DraftKings. Use code CHGO when you sign on up. And let's get cracking about the Chicago Red Stars. Thanks everyone for joining us. It's been a minute. And it's been so long that Claire has departed. For us, a quick second, and we've got a special guest today. I want to welcome my friend, homie, and colleague, Jason Anderson, a pro soccer wire out in DC, slotting in today in light of really all the World Cup madness happening. So thanks, buddy, for finding some time to hang out with me. Welcome to Digital Chicago Red Stars.
I'm glad to be on.
Yeah, man. Happy to have you. We were chatting a little bit, obviously in text. We've been mutuals for quite a long time. And we were chatting off mic just a little bit about covering tough seasons for your local club team. Again, just shout out to everyone who may be joining us and watching us live. Reminder to you all that we do these bi-weekly. So anytime we get together on CHGO Red Stars, there's always like a bulk of information or a bulk of games and things that we have to like reflect upon and sort of like discuss after having letting it all marinate. And something that has been happening for us this year alongside the Red Stars is a pretty historically tough season. They've had a lot of losses. I think they've only got one draw to date. They've got a couple wins. It's been a tough one to cover. There's all these like outside factors that we've been talking about that are out of the player's control. And when we were thinking about how to navigate today's episode, it was like, who's great to have on here and talk about a tough time covering a local team is our boy Jason. So maybe let's just like start with like that, just to kind of have like a little bit of different energy because we're going to talk about all kinds of things. We're going to talk about obviously the World Cup on the horizon. We are going to talk about some of those losses. I'd love to get your thoughts on what you're seeing from the Red Stars, different lens. But I think at this point we're not deep, but we're like definitely into the second half of the season. There's already been, there's 13 matches gone of a 22 game regular season. For most teams, Challenge Cup is about halfway through of the group stage for them. When you have a team that is going through difficult stretches of play like this, and the story or the storylines or the narratives that you're looking at a team and trying to cover aren't necessarily changing. It just is like from week to week, you're just like, here's another one, and then there's another one, and there's another one. So talk to me about navigating a long, tough season like that.
I guess what I would say, because I was just writing about Chicago last night, because I knew I was coming on here and I had kind of missed the chance to watch the game live from this weekend. So I was like, I'm going to watch the game. I'm off on Monday, so I watched that game. And when I saw the score line and I just saw the general reaction, I was like, okay, it's not as bad as like the Portland game. It's not as bad as the Kansas City game, but it's probably not going to be great. And then I watched the game. I was like, this is like for a bad team. And for, I've covered the Spirit for years. I covered the Spirit in the year where they literally broke the NWSL goalless streak, scored one goal, and then broke it again. So they scored one goal in it's like 1,300 minutes of soccer or something like that. Truly like the desert of soccer joy in 2018. And then also from a very different angle, a different kind of soccer misery with everything else that happened at the Spirit after that. I've covered DC United for years in MLS, and for any Red Stars fans who know MLS, Chicago actually reminds me a lot of DC United in a lot of ways, and that's not necessarily good news. There are times that Chicago has done better than DC, but when I watched this game, I was like, I see progress from a few weeks ago. I see yeah, Chicago probably deserved better in this particular game, but they let themselves down in a couple moments, which you kind of have to look at. You kind of have to accept that you're going to watch when a season's going like this. You have to accept that bad moments are coming. There's no cure for that. The team is not in a good place, from a mental perspective. They've made some changes that have made some level of sense. I think I prefer them in this 4-2-3-1 they've been playing lately rather than the back three. That was, I think, a necessary change, but it's more like stop the bleeding than it is like this is where we turn it around. And that's kind of the whole vibe this year, I think, for Chicago is how do you not let this become like Gotham last year where it's like 12 straight losses. I think that is maybe, and like, how do you build for next season? I think that is already the goal. I was doing the math right before I came on here to make, if San Diego keeps their points per game pace in sixth place in the final playoff spot, Chicago has to, I think, win all of their games left in the season to get in. Or maybe it might be that they can get like one draw. They cannot lose. They do not have room to lose again. So I don't think that's a surprise. If anyone's listening to this, I don't think that there's any like, we've still got to shut out the playoffs, right? Like no one's talking about that anymore. Which I know, like it's June, it's too early to be dropping that, but I've been there. And at this point, you're like, okay, who will be important next season? Who can we, start to lean on a little more? Ella Stevens, I thought looked really good against Gotham. And not her first good game. That's a player where I'm like, okay, this is a player that you can build around for next year. Some of these players that don't have, Tierna Davidson, Casey Kruger, they're going to, Casey Kruger doesn't really need to bounce back. I think she's playing well as is. Davidson isn't playing that well, but she'll bounce back with time to get her knee, back to where it was. I mean, she's playing, obviously she's fit enough to play, but it's not the same as like full sharpness after the amount of time she was out. But there are some other players on this group that you want to see grow into more, you can place more responsibility on them. And I think that's really where I always came to covering. I mean, some of these seasons in the past with the teams out here in DC have been truly a slog. And it really does become about like, what can we find that is a positive, and like, maybe we can like reduce the number of negatives. The goals that Gotham scored in this game are really the only two like big mistakes Chicago made defensively. And like it's a throw-in goal. It's one where it's like, okay, this should never happen. Lynn Williams should never be this open. And you can see like, it's kind of heartbreaking to see like Davidson point to Williams, and you can see her point and yell for someone to do something, but everyone is zonal and everyone is so committed to their zonal spot that no one moves. And Williams, meanwhile, is just like,
when you're too organized and it goes against you.
You need to do a little improv, and just everyone held their spot. The second goal, I think, it hasn't been Alyssa Naeher's best year. I don't think that's a secret. And I think this is a goal where if she's fully confident, she trusts her wall a little more. And that time it takes her to like reshuffle her feet is the difference between getting a hand to the ball or, alley long shot is like as close to perfect as possible. It like skims the crossbar. But this is a save normally Naeher would make in good times. And I don't really blame her too much for not being at her best, because it's no secret that the whole atmosphere in Chicago is not the best. The club is not set up for these players to be at their best. All of those things are like, they're not good. I'm not going to, mince words that it's the players themselves know that they can do better, but also I don't know that they have much of a like foundation to be better. And so in that like kind of rubble that they're working through, you look for like, okay, this is something that when the situation around the club, when the atmosphere around the club starts to like settle and get moving in a good direction, that we can then build on, because this is like a combination of players that is working, or this is a player who can go, like I said with Stevens, can go from like a decent player who gets in a lot of games to now like be a little bit more of a like responsible player that is like carrying some of the load. And that's what's next, I think, for this team. It's not about, wins would be great. I'm sure everyone wants to see wins, but like long term, it's maybe more important that some of the younger players on this team get their shot. I mentioned Gotham earlier. Gotham, last season they kept using the same like 14 players over and over again, and I got yelled at a little bit for saying that they should stop doing that and just start sending out the younger players, and just because it's a lost cause. This was like further down the stretch. This was like last 4 or 5 games. It was like, just send your young players out, full evaluation mode. And I don't think Chicago is at that point yet, but they should maybe start to like pepper them in a little bit so that you don't get to like the last 3 games of the season come and like players who just are not getting starts. Ali Schlegel comes off the bench a bunch of times and has been really effective in that role. I think she brings a lot of energy, but like you do kind of need to evaluate her in a starting role in league play against a full strength opponent a little more often than I've seen so far. That's just one example, but yeah, it's you have to sort of change your mentality as like we come to sports to like hoping to see our team win games and like bring us some joy. And when the season gets like this, you kind of have to like box that feeling up and box that mentality up and like put it to the side and be like, how can we like make sure that this year is not repeated next year? What can I look for that will give me some hope that won't happen? Because that's kind of where and Chicago's not alone. There are a few other teams. Angel City is very close to that boat. It's been a weird year where like normally the league is like very condensed still, and this year it's more like we have like 4 teams that are kind of adrift and 7 teams that are kind of out in front. And then Louisville is kind of like, hanging on by like the tips of their fingernails to try and stay in that race. But yeah, for Chicago, it's about growth. And hopefully you get some joy here and there, but it's not going to be that often. I hate to say it.
Thinking of like just the actual like soccering of it all. Like, I love that you plug the piece because you're so good at this. This is something where it's like I remember where you would just like tweet about it or put threads about it, be like, okay, like what are the standings looking like? Like if you're a bottom half or lower half table team, what do you need to do moving forward? But I love that you brought it up earlier in the season, and folks can catch it on Pro Soccer Wire. But that type of stuff for me is like important because I think it was after, I can't remember if it was after the Racing Louisville Challenge Cup loss. They had 2 losses where just they gave up 9 goals. They had that 5-goal blowout against the Courage, and then they followed it up with a 4-goal loss, to the Current in Challenge Cup. And I think it was right after those back-to-back games. I'm like, this sucks, man. I was just like, and at this point, I'm like, I think I said something where I'm like, I would not blame a single Red Stars player who goes off to a World Cup and then comes back and is like, I've checked out. Like, sorry, the World Cup took it all out of me. I cannot come back. Like, it's one of those things. And then I think I even was just like, what? Like, you got to try to reevaluate some things here, because at this point, it feels like nearly everything that could be possibly obtainable for a club in an NWSL year is now virtually like nearly unobtainable at this point.
Yeah.
And I thought it was like, I tweeted much faster than I did the math. And I was like, but I feel like this is right around the point where it's just actually, if this is how you're trending this season, there's lots of things that are not obtainable for you at this moment, whether it's Challenge Cup, Shield, you kiss goodbye, or at this point, a spot in the playoffs. So I love that you brought it sooner and then you wrote it out. Like, here's what teams have to do at this point, just a couple weeks into this second half of the season. And if you are one of those teams that are Angel City, a Kansas City Current, at this point, the Chicago Red Stars, like your margin for error or losses is like obsolete. And at this stage, if you've got a season where you're mostly racking up L's instead of like results, it might not bode well for you moving forward. So I'm with you in terms of like, there has to be like, maybe for some reason, maybe the math is different in Chicago and in that locker room, but maybe that conversation hasn't happened quite yet. And like, there has to be a point in this season though where that very realistic perspective shift has to happen, to the point where you're like, okay, yeah, we actually should play some of these first year players a little bit more just to see what they're giving, or even these second year players at this point, those, because they were just those first year players that you were relying on last year and kind of like that first wave of roster turnover. And then we saw even, this last offseason was like the massive turnover where it was like, okay, yeah, like maybe this is actually year zero. But I don't even know if I really consider this like year zero for Chicago Red Stars kind of next era rebuild, because of all of the unknown variables at this point. They're still navigating a sale. When is that going to come through? There's no GM at the moment. The coaching staff is going to be the coaching staff likely moving forward, because I would anticipate that any new ownership or any new GM is going to want to have a role or hand in selecting potential new coaching staff. So this is kind of what it is.
It's like
forward.
year -1 rather than year
zero.
Yeah,
rather than year zero, which I think maybe to follow up for you, I think it is great to sort of get your perspective on this, because you're sort of looking at clubs who have had to go through a series of unfortunate off-field things. When it comes to the Spirit, I mean, these are two teams that have had to deal with like ownership issues and varying resources along the way since their inception in NWSL. And we have both of these teams, Spirit and Chicago, who are like just 2 years removed from a championship final.
Right.
So Spirit and Chicago are both in Louisville in 2021, going through it, and the Spirit come out on top, have a championship. There's various interfighting with ownership amongst the Spirit, and then to the point where players are like writing statements, writing letters, putting their names, backing Michelle King, and now there's new ownership. So that then you have 2022 and the new ownership is in place. It's like, hey, here we go. And then they have this very challenging season in 2022 where they set some unfortunate records of their own, like as many draws and breaking the record there, right? So now we've got 2023, and it sort of feels like this is where they wanted to be last year, maybe thinking where all those things were going to come into play. Right. But even in 2022, there were still some, there were still headlines around the team regarding coaching shifts and coaching change and maybe cultural things as well. I think we can include in that in terms of like trying to battle through it in 2022. So now it sort of feels like kind of like that clean slate. The resources are there. The investment is there. They tabbed who they wanted to for staff. Getting Don Scott was fucking massive. Mark Parsons, massive. And so it's like, okay, all these things are like clicking. And it's almost like, I don't want to say it's like a blueprint, because everyone's plan is always going to be a little different in terms of how they're building a team and how their ownership is giving the infrastructure to a franchise. But it's hard not to connect the dots to all of these things in terms of the success on the pitch.
Yeah, to say the least. 2022 is a real interesting year when you try and apply the lessons the Spirit might take and bring them to other teams, because I think the ownership change didn't actually get finalized until after the season began.
Yeah.
Because the league also moved slowly. It took a while for it was the mechanisms involved to get this to happen were extraordinarily complicated, but then you also have to bring it to NWSL, that a league that is moving faster than it ever has, but is still kind of slow. And at this time last year was slower. And so all that stuff took a while to shake out. And I think they entered 2022 with, a lot of burdens off them in a lot of ways, knowing that stuff would be finalized. But you also had things like the preseason trip for them. They went to Florida. From what I know, that was still Steve Baldwin still owned the team technically, and so he was the one footing the bill for that, and therefore they're getting his resources and not Michelle Kang's resources, which are significantly higher, as well as just she'll also just like spend more. It's not that she has more money, also it's that she's like, yeah, like let's put it towards the soccer team. So that stuff was all on hold. There were a lot of people who were sort of signed to like a 1 year, and I don't just mean soccer side, I mean across the whole organization, signed to contracts that ran through 2022, that were just, it was sort of like survival mode, and they were in the like aftermath of survival mode where this stuff couldn't just be, it wasn't just over, you're still kind of in a holding pattern. And I think that contributed to, you know, the combination of that is kind of dragging you down, and the emotions of 2021 are kind of exhausting. Like they burned really bright for a little while, but also they kind of wore it out. There was nothing left in the tank. They went through that very weird Challenge Cup of last year. They got to the final of that, and I feel like in that game is where the emotion finally just like there was nothing left in the tank to use that could fuel them to one more big win. And then they played like 6,000 games in like a month.
Yes. Terrible front end schedule.
One of the most ridiculous things I've ever seen covering the sport. And it wiped them out. And for Chicago, I think fortunately the league maybe learned a lesson from that they might not apply a schedule like that to anyone, which is good. We don't want to see that anymore. But yeah, for Chicago, I think when, and you know, it's still a very big open question as to when any of this stuff is going to work itself out. But like once ownership gets settled, once somebody else comes in that can give this team the resources they deserve, that has ambitions to take it to a better level than it is. And I don't mean, you know, to come back to the spirit, like Bill Lynch sold to Steve Baldwin, and the resources did go up, but it wasn't like through the roof. It was like, you know, more. It was nice, but it wasn't a lot. And then we find out what comes with that. Not so good. I think Chicago needs to make sure that when they make the changeover, that they can kind of, you don't want that holding pattern. You can learn a lot from it, but it's also kind of wasted time. It would be really good for them to like get this done now, so that like the next 6 months are your holding pattern time, so that you hit 2024 with things intact. One of the reasons the Spirit have had a much better 2023 is that they, by like November of last year, already had their key leadership pieces in place. Mark Krikorian had been hired before. Mark Parsons was already, I don't think he'd been announced, but he was already like hired by November. Don Scott was in November. The staffing up was already happening. And so they entered the draft period, all the trades. And I mean, they wanted to make 1 billion trades and they got shot down on most of them. And then had like the wildest second round. They traded that in and out like 600 times. I sat across from their staff while that was going on, and it was nuts in Philly at the draft. But yeah, having that stuff squared away so that you can make those moves, so that like you have someone to call and say like, hey, we need to spend like 40,000 in allocation money to get this draft pick. These are basic things that it doesn't seem like Chicago has in place, because the ownership situation is so, you know, you've got an owner who's leaving for very good reasons, and you don't really have anyone that's taking over. And so you're going to get the answer on that stuff it's not even going to be a no. It's going to be that no one is picking up the phone. And so it kind of like, it ruins your ability to plan anything that isn't like the next day. Like, okay, we can get a flight to our next away game, but we can't plan what like 2025 will look like. We can't start to think of, you know, hey, I know this player playing for Barcelona will be out of contract and would love to come to the US and has like a good relationship with someone on our team. We can't plan anything like that because we don't have someone who can say like, okay, you can put together this financial package now and talk to them now so that they are ready to go when their contract is up. All these little things add up to the instability in Chicago, and they need to make sure that once the stuff we don't get to see, because like we get to watch them play soccer, we don't get to watch like boardroom negotiations and read emails. Once that stuff is squared away, hopefully as soon as possible, so that they can set themselves up to actually like go at 2024 rather than just sort of like have it happen to them. Because this year is kind of like, you know, Morgan Gautreau, Vanessa DiMarnardo, Danny Colaprico all leaving. That happened to Chicago. That wasn't Chicago being proactive. It was like, oh no, our midfield has left. What can we do? And the answer becomes like, ask Yuki Nagasato to play, or actually Yuki Nagasato saying, I will play midfield because I noticed we don't have any midfielders right now. Which is not good for anyone. Like that's not where she belongs.
It's like on one side, you're like, wow, what a smart, brilliant player. And then on the other side of that coin, you're like, wow, that's really terrible that this smart, brilliant player is like low key coaching and using her awareness to say like, you know, we don't have anything here. I will try.
This is something that happened with the Spirit actually. Now I'm thinking about it. Tori Huster in 2019 was like one of the best right backs in the league. And that happened in a preseason game. Richie Burke did not have a plan. And she was like, I can go in, I can step in at right back for, you know, I'll give you half an hour. And then she played well and they figured it out. Paige Nielsen came in preseason. They're like, well, you're a capable player, but we don't really know what we're going to do with you. And she was like, try me at center back. And they were like, okay, we'll get you out there. And then, and now she's a starting center back in the league. It's not,
oh my God.
Like, it's great for these players to be able to like have that awareness of where they fit into the system and be able to like contribute to that extent. But like, it doesn't speak to a healthy environment or club that someone they have to so often. So yeah, Chicago, that's one of the many consequences of just so much is happening to the Red Stars and they are not affecting enough. They are not the active participant. It's just sort of washing over them and then they sort of recover. And until the off-field stuff gets not just squared away, but squared away in a way where like everyone in the organization is pulling in roughly the same direction, they will have it. That's all they can do. And it becomes, you know, you have years where sometimes that does work. I'm thinking of DC United was in the Shield race one year with a roster where it was like, this team is not going to go anywhere near the playoffs. But that's like hitting the lottery, to get so many people who have like reasons to not do well, all pulling hard in the same direction at the same time, hitting good form, getting the breaks. Chicago is not getting breaks on top of everything else that, I'm thinking of that goal that Bianca St. George scored that we went to VAR and then they were like, well, we don't really have an angle. So
never mind.
Don't worry about it. I'm glad the broadcast spent some time. Leanne Sanderson was like, boy, I'd really like to see that one back. Everyone would.
Not just you, Leanne, whole city, I would say.
That's a Red Stars 2023 moment. When things are going bad, you get that like, well, it looked offside, but I don't know. You don't get the rub of the green on that. You just never do.
I just am like, but you know, I think like you're talking about that goal specifically, but I think at this point too, at this phase of the season, I'm like, I think that's this is an I feel statement. I can only speak for myself. I think that's what I look for. Yeah. Not just those silver linings and what are the other things that can be gained in a season like this, even if it's just through like, individual like on field evaluations and things like that and checking out performances, but like the response, like looking at this team and how they are trying to remain competitive in these games. So it's like they've got those two like massive back-to-back losses where they could see the 9 goals, and then it's like they get a game back at home or in Bridgeview and it's a 3-2 loss, right? But it's like the response in going down against Portland or going on the road to Gotham and seeing the game from them there and being like, okay, like there were some interesting things here, and here's another game where it looks like the like a 4-2-3-1 is ideal,
Mhm.
and has, I guess, for lack of a better phrasing, has mostly been working in terms of trying to plug in personnel into areas in which they can be successful.
Mhm.
Because I think we saw pretty early on the three back was actually working against so many of the
Yeah.
players early on in the season, and it took I feel a little bit longer than necessary to kind of make that shift and exchange
Yeah.
it. But now we're seeing, and I think that's, for me, I think the important stuff that I'm looking at. You want to see the response in some of those games, and you want to see like players who are trying to stay competitive and get in there. I mean, my God, I think it like I like it's a loss, right? But it's like the goal that Curry Recaro gets, I like
Mhm.
wigged out because I was
Yeah.
like, oh, that was amazing. It was like in the run of play, like it was a, you saw build up. She made an alternate run, like it's the and like was in the, I was like, oh my God, like that's, and it was
With
just
high
like,
pressure too.
and I'm just like, it's something. It was like, it's on. Some folks are probably gonna listen to this and be like, this bitch is sad, but like it was like a moment where I was like, I like was celebrating it, and I was like, oh,
Yeah.
that was so good for them, because it's like, it's things like that that we're just like not really seeing from the team in game scenarios. And this was a specific game scenario with that, like they generated, like they could look at it and say, look at, we generated this, it was a good goal, like, and they end up losing this game. But there's like things in there that where you're like, okay, there's like good response here, and there's stretches of play that you can like hang your hat on and are hopeful that maybe like they build on that moving forward. It's not to say that like it's, to borrow your phrase from earlier, where it's going to like completely change around the season. But there are things here, little things within some of these games that it looks like they're trying to respond, where they
Mhm.
continue to kind of build up. I also don't know. It's ad time. I don't know if these are the kind of games, even though they're losses, and you see good response from the Red Stars, where you're like, you know what? There's something here, and I'm gonna go to a game. But maybe it is. Maybe you're like, you know what? You're listening to Jason, you're listening to Sandra, and you're like, they're saying that the Red Stars are turning it on in certain stretches of the game. They're showing a response in some of these losses. Maybe I'll go and get tickets to a Red Stars game. And if you do want to go get tickets to a Red Stars game, you should use Game Time. Okay, because it is absolute stress-free way to look up tickets to a game, because buying tickets to your favorite event should not be stressful. And Game Time app is the fast and easiest way to get tickets, not just for sports, but for music, concerts, comedy, theater shows near you. It's got amazing deals on last minute tickets, and their best price guarantee. You can stop stressing over the tickets and just start getting hyped for all sorts of fun that you'll have at these events. You get flash deals for last minute tickets. You can find all sorts. It's an easy to use app. You get image of the seats. You get your lowest price guarantee. You also get event cancellation protection, all sorts of good stuff. So make sure you download the Game Time app, and maybe you want to get some tickets to a Red Star game, because there's still plenty left in this season. Not to be confused with the World Cup, which maybe we'll pivot to a little bit here now. So I don't know if you heard, Jason, but there's a World Cup coming up. It's going to be in Australia, New Zealand. It's kicking off on July 20th. There's going to be a break in regular season play. So if you are looking for tickets for the Red Stars, take a good look at what works for you, because some of them actually might be Challenge Cup games. So even though there's going to be a break in some regular season play, there will still be a handful of Challenge Cup games that take place. So at this point for the Red Stars, they've still got a couple of games left in Challenge Cup, and who knows? Maybe I'm wrong, Jason. Maybe those conversations have started in the locker room. They're like, there's a lot of things that are obtainable for us here, but you know what's not? Challenge Cup. Maybe they try to get like that second place, because it's kind of
Mhm.
like Louisville's running away with this
Right.
Central Division. But maybe they're like, hey, we can try to win the best second place seeded team and head on into a Challenge Cup semifinal, because there's things to win there. You get $1 million prize that's going to be split up between semifinalists, and a shot at the title, which
Yeah.
Chicago has been chasing, anything, literally, for years now. But who knows? I don't know how they're going to fare in these Challenge Cup games. They're unlike some other teams, like the Spirit, for example. They are not losing a ton of players to the World Cup. They're going to be without Alyssa Naeher because she's pretty much been the de facto number one for the United States since post Rio Olympics. And they're going to be without Cheyna Matthews, who this was a player I was very excited that the Red Stars worked out a deal with to get this season. Cheyna Matthews used to play for the Spirit. Yeah. And I just, from what we've seen in her limited minutes of play, I think this was probably the perfect player for them to grab in terms of trying to find someone to add to their depth and have experience. It's just someone who like knows what it means to play in NWSL, who knows what to expect in games in this league, and like who is no stranger to scoring goals or having an impact in the attack. And unfortunately, not only is she probably the hardest working player in the NWSL as a mom of three, but she's been working her way back into form post-pregnancy. And she's also unfortunately has had to deal with a little bit of nagging injuries this first half of the regular season. So the Red Stars were very mindful of that and tried to work her in as much as both parties wanted to get her time. So now it's official. She's going to head off to the World Cup. And I still think that's a loss, significant loss for the Red Stars, even with the limited minutes that we saw from Matthews. But in those limited minutes, you can hear all the time, like the oohs and ahs from the crowd whenever she's on the ball. Those of us even watching in the press box are like, wow, this game changes a bit when we see an CHGO or a Cheyna Matthews kind of come in and get a little run and gun with it and try to make something happen. So this is two players who the team's going to be without, and you've got your starting goalkeeper and a player who's been a bit of a game changer for the Red Stars. I think probably you could look at Matthews and her short time with the Red Stars, and her most impactful game is in that very first win, one of two for the Red Stars, three for the Red Stars this year, against Kansas City Current. It's like they lose Mal Pugh. She's not coming back. The whole like storyline and narrative around it, you started to feel shift. It's like they're going to be doomed without Mal Pugh. And then you have a game where Cheyna Matthews mixes it up, has an incredible impact, and you're like, hold on a second, maybe not. It was still early enough in the season where you're like pumping the brakes, right? It's like they didn't want to lose, like, you know, start the season out 0-3, and they didn't because Cheyna Matthews had this incredible game. Ella Stevens, as well as someone you mentioned, but it just didn't manifest into anything else, unfortunately. So losing these players isn't just like for this next series of like World Cup games. I think that's the other thing too. It's like we got to like break this down on like what it means for clubs across NWSL, because it's like there are some teams who are going to compete in the World Cup who might be gone for an extended period of time. There might be some players who return earlier than expected. Maybe things don't go well in the group stage and they come on back and they're back in by August. But even then, that's such like a grueling experience to go through. Don't expect them to come back like August 1 and be like, I'm ready to go.
Right.
So I just feel like for the Red Stars, it's just like another one of these things where it's like, okay, well, here's another series of things that we're going to have to go through moving forward. Like that availability report, I don't think is going to get any shorter even when World Cup players come back.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to a few years where, like 2015 World Cup, I think Ali Krieger pretty famously came back quickly because she was upset she didn't play more at the World Cup, and kind of raced back to play for the Spirit. But that's like a one-off. Most of the time for the players, like let's say the U.S. wins the thing, like Naeher, much to her chagrin, is going to have like media obligations and like parties. I'm sure she would rather miss those. I think she would like to be much more of an introvert than those situations allow for. But it's a weird moment where in one way it's like maybe a positive for Chicago, not to lose those players, but to have other teams losing more of their core players. Just in terms of gaining some momentum. getting some positive results in now, because like, yeah, you can say like, oh well, it's it's a win during the World Cup, it's not that big of a deal, but like if you haven't won very often, if you beat anyone, it is a big deal. If you get that win, it does feel like a big deal. It does help you build confidence for the next game, and then maybe you can start to get moving. Um, I feel this from the Gotham game. If Chicago can replicate that performance, just the performance level, they will probably score more goals than they got in this game, and they probably won't concede as often. They're very fixable goals, so there's progress to be made. There's somewhere to go with this break. This isn't just like, oh great, now two of our veteran leaders who've seen a lot in this league and can bring so much to the table on the field, now they're not here. I think this is a moment that you want to see individual players like grab their opportunity, but you also want to see this group just maybe look at the whole thing as an opportunity. The Challenge Cup, like you said, Louisville, unfortunately for Chicago, has been like kind of going full steam.
Yeah.
Right. They're like the one team in the Challenge Cup that is like, let's try and win the Challenge Cup.
They're gonna wreck up Challenge Cup. I can't wait to see it.
And so it's bad to be in their group. It's not a good, and Kansas City has picked up some wins. Obviously the goal difference from the Chicago game helped them keep pace. They're only 3 points behind Louisville. But if you're Chicago, I would say these are the games that maybe you should focus on to a certain extent, because if you can disrupt, if you can look each other in the face after a game and you say like, hey, Louisville and Kansas City are trying to win this thing. They are like starting Dabinia. They're starting, I mean, they won't be able to in these games because of the World Cup, but like Dabinia, Savannah DeMello, they've been starting these games. We're getting their best shot and we went out and beat them anyway. That does mean something. That can build some morale, that can build some connections for the future that this team desperately needs. So in a way, this window is like more important to Chicago than it is to most teams. Are like, let's not like fall apart here. If we're playing well, let's keep it going to the best extent we can without our biggest and best national team stars. But if you're not a team like that, if you're like, well, we just want to get something good happening, this is your moment. So I would hope that Chicago can kind of carry what they did right in the response. I'll go back to the Portland game, the response there as well. Carry those positives into this break, because this might be a chance to pick some wins off, figure some things out that you haven't had time to figure out about the group. And then proceed from there, being in a better place coming out of the break than you went into it. Because it is kind of, these World Cup breaks are always such a weird moment where we've seen teams that are doing great just continue to steamroll. In the past, in the World Cup break, we've also seen teams kind of lose their way. The break kind of, undoes whatever they've got, whatever secret sauce they've got going, it messes it up. So it's kind of it's a little bit of a chaos moment in the league, that the league's already highly chaotic. But this is like the rules change a little bit. The players that are often in the highlight reel, like Gotham is not going to have Lynn Williams. Just to point their way, that changes things a lot for them. That they've been a big success story in a lot of ways this year, turning it around. But like a lot of what they've done well has leaned on the players that they're about to lose to the World Cup. And those players have been keeping players out of the lineup. Sinead Farley has been keeping, players who have been in the league for the last few years. She hasn't been, pretty famously not in the league for a while here. And she's played them out of their spot in the lineup. How do those players respond? And that's going to be happening all over the league. Whereas in Chicago, you don't really have that. You have a bunch of players who have kind of their established connection within the system. I'm glad you mentioned the formation change. I'm glad that it's happened, because I think simplifying things was a big deal for Chicago. And matters even more in this moment where, there's going to be a lot of not different looks, but like different applications of how the teams want to play. They're missing their key ingredients, so they have to alter some things a little bit. Chicago kind of simplifying everything and making it easier on themselves. It does, I don't want to overpromise, but it does kind of open the door to getting some momentum going. We'll see. I have forgotten completely what their next game is because I clicked out of that tab.
It's all Challenge Cup from here. I think there's a regular season game that's going to take place back at home.
Yeah.
But right after that, they're jumping right back into Challenge Cup.
Full everyone going, and Challenge Cup games on the weekend, which will be nice rather than like a Wednesday night trying to get through rush hour traffic to a stadium. I prefer it this way. But yeah, it's a big opportunity for. It's not going to save the season, but it may be a big building block towards making sure next season is nothing like this. I think that would be if I'm in the locker room with Chicago, if I'm a voice in that group, I'm like, this is a big moment for us that we need to like be in a positive mentality. We need to just sort of forget what happened before this. And let's like hit these next 2 months running. Let's just sort of like try and how when teams are losing, they get blown out in the first half. They're down 3-0, and their coach is like, let's just try and win the second half.
Try some stuff.
Yeah. Try and win the next 2 months. It's not going to save the season, but it will maybe help next year. But yeah, this is a kind of a good opportunity for Chicago if they can build on the good stuff from the last couple of games and not because they've had a couple moments this year where they've had, a good 60 minutes in a game, but then the follow-up is like the Portland loss. They need to make absolutely sure that doesn't happen again. Keep the car on the road. Like maybe you don't win the race, but you're at least on the road. And maybe come out of August and hit September as like, last year's Spirit were, they weren't able to do this, but they were kind of hoping. They were like, look, we're not going to make the playoffs, but we're kind of hoping to spoil some things for some other teams. Be NWSL's hater. Just try and keep everyone else from having a good time. But yeah, this is where you build that. This is kind of maybe a welcome break in a way from the norm for Chicago. It just sort of, the league is in a different phase when the World Cup players are gone, and maybe something shakes loose.
I too embrace the break from the season. It's still a little bit of ways away. They're going to be back at home for a regular season match against San Diego, and then they're going to have another one to close out things on the road against Houston, and then it's all Challenge Cup pretty much from that on.
Chicago at Houston feels like a weather delay game.
Yeah,
this is another one of my fields of expertise, and that one to me this year is like, boy, that game might not happen on time.
We do love talking about the weather on these shows, but no, we'll see. I'm very curious about it. I'm entering the break as well with wide eyes and an open heart, 100%. Yeah, no, I'm with you. It's refreshing to chat with you, bro, and kind of get your perspectives on it. I loved the intersect between Chicago and the Spirit in terms of what they've had to go through, as franchises and players having to navigate these things that are typically out of their control. So I appreciate you, man. Thank you for coming on and chatting with me today. Thanks everybody for joining us. Just want to let you know, the best way to support the show and the work is with a CHGO diehard membership. You get access to all sorts of awesome perks. You get podcasts and live shows every day on every single team because we got a lot of them here in Chicago. You get post-game shows. You get premium written content. If you're a member at allchgo.com, you get 20% off events. Get access to merch, a free shirt when you become a member, and access to the CHGO Lounge, our members-only Discord. So sign on up for a CHGO diehard membership. But that's it for us today at CHGO Red Stars. We will be back eventually, if we don't disappear into the southern hemisphere of the World Cup, we will be back. But we'll keep you all posted on what's up next with us. But that's it. Thanks for joining us. Peace out.